Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and this week we are revisiting the fundamentals of landscape design for part 3. So in a recent live show, I got to discussing some of the thoughts and ideas I have behind how I make a landscape. And I realized that if we return to this idea of the fundamentals of landscape design, which I think is now like a 6-year-old video, or series of videos rather now, I was like, you know what, I think it's time to actually show more of the practical side of a lot of these things. So I've grabbed a big sheet of drawing pad paper today, and I'm working with some Prismacolor ebony, nice dark pencils in the 6 to 8B range. And I really wanted to look at things like lines, perspective, shapes, value, and positive and negative space. So this is kind of a little bit of a long-winded video, but I do hope you guys stick around for it, because I really kind of go into depth of a lot of the stuff that I think about for every one of my pieces, which actually is a lot of the core elements and principles of design. They're just really subconscious for me. So this is a good explanation of how to look at landscapes while also applying a lot of really basic concepts to that. And I think going through this, you guys will be able to see that it's a lot less complicated than it seems. So for the first part of this, I really want to dive into the idea of line work and perspective. I'm going to give a couple of boxes out here, little thumbnails, so we can start playing around with just different concepts. So there's a lot that can be done with just basic line work that really kind of starts to tell a story. And that's a really important thing when it comes to designing a landscape or a composition of any kind, really, is establishing the idea of the story. And so much of that can be done just with a couple of smaller lines to begin to give your viewer the idea of what exactly is going on in your piece. Now, I don't want to sound like a broken record in this series and repeat a lot of the stuff that I've said before, but I will say that some of this I had covered in part 1, as well as some of this I've actually covered in 6 Tricks for Better Landscapes. But just starting out, a basic, perspective line, drop, you think, any kind of composition, any kind of, landscape specifically, you drop in a horizon line and you put in a vanishing point. This is a really simple concept, but for every one of my paintings, I do pretty much exactly that. It's the first thing I do. I'm like, where is my horizon? Where is my horizon? And once I know where my horizon is, I can start then laying out different shapes. Sometimes I need a vanishing point, sometimes I don't. This vanishing point usually helps when I am in my sketchbook. So as soon as you drop in that point, then you can just, eyeball out some lines. So whether that be, fairly standard one like that, you can go, a little more, to one side, push that idea this way. Another great one to do is, do like a curved or an arced horizon, and then utilizing also more curved lines that way. Even just, to one side. A lot of times I will end up doing curves like this, like not just a straight line, like really kind of arc it out and around. This particular way is really, really useful for doing rivers, because then you can just follow a little bit of that line, kind of squiggle and wiggle that a little bit, and then when you start dropping out the baseland to fill out those areas, you're left with a river in perspective without having to worry about doing those harder angles. You can also move it up towards the top of the horizon, give yourself less of a sky, still a relatively centered vanishing point. But I find moments like this then give me the ability to, we're talking really basic perspective here. So what do you do with basic perspective? Well, you build out, you build boxes and you go like that, 2-point, and simple stuff like that. And when you do this just, basic boxes, you might think, well, that's fine, they're basic boxes, but how do I apply that? How do I do that? Work even lower. Don't necessarily say, oh, well, now I have to, push the object, higher, lower on the horizon. And when you start thinking about, again, placement, higher versus lower, that's where I start having fun with, say, cliffs. So let me say I want to have a path down the center of this. Use the edges here in perspective as a cliff face. And now we've got a one-point perspective piece with the idea of giant blocky cliff faces with a figure, So there's a lot more you can do with just perspective lines than what might show up as, a regular cityscape or something like that. I do this a lot too. So this is just, basic one-point perspective here. And all I did was just squiggle up some lines, and they all, mostly follow in that space. So it does still work as a single-point perspective. But all I'm doing is just adding a little bit of a wiggle to, a brush or a pencil. And those lines act as guidelines. And if you're doing, again, like curves, angles, stuff like this, it's really fun to mess with, compositions that way, because it gives a skewed sense of, perspective and both visually as well as, metaphorically. You're off center with your character, so everything just feels, a little strange in that sense. So in just angling the horizon, you've created a sense of inherent symbolism within the structure of the composition itself. There's nothing in here that is specifically complex. You're all just following, again, basic, block perspectives and everything like that. That's really all it takes to make an interesting landscape. Think about different climates, different environments, and just apply that into, a specific area. I might not have to put out the perspective lines to be able to come up with a weird cliff face overlooking an ocean or something like that. But that's all it really takes to do this. As long as you're thinking about, the basics of art, the elements and principles of design, everything kind of follows in suit. So in addition to, perspective lines and stuff like that, it's the other thing I find to be really vitally important, especially when designing a landscape, is shapes and values. Now, one of my favorite exercises to do, and you guys can see this going back several years in almost every sketchbook I have, are mini thumbnails. Now, for the mini thumbnails, I do technically 2 layers, but all I'm doing for these is is just a big marker or a big brush pen or something to just block out different shapes and different things like that. This is really fun to do because you don't necessarily have to have a general idea in mind when you start. You can just use the shape of the pen itself in order to get unique and interesting concepts and ideas. One of my favorite methods for this I picked up from an artist by the name of Scott Robinson. He has got a handful of videos here on YouTube that doesn't post super often. But he introduced me to this idea of using Copic wide sketch markers in order to do exactly that, do big blocky areas of shape. And one of the greatest things about using essentially a bigger material on a smaller page is that the size of, in this case, the big chisel tip allows you to free yourself up a little bit. Being able to just use that shape and, make fairly random lines. I'm following in general, sort of like linear perspective here, but just, you know, let's see what this mark does. Let's see what that mark does. You know, put a big thing in here, something like that, and then, you know, a few layers of the lighter color, switch into you know, a darker one, and put another layer in, and start, you know, mapping out more land. And you don't necessarily have to be precise with it, and that's why it's so much fun. And bear in mind, you don't have to go out of your way to get some of these. I recommend not doing that, actually. Instead, a very easy thing to access is a big giant Sharpie marker. Obviously, the chisel tip is a bit smaller than these are, but what you do get out of that is a blocky line. And if you're working, say, on, you know, a thumbnail about that big chisel tip allows you to really kind of make big decisions like that and figure out, you know, where you want certain shapes. And part of this isn't just that shape, but more importantly, and what we'll get back to our sketch page down here in a second, is positive and negative space. Another big important part of the elements and principles of design, positive and negative space. So when you think about your, you know, landscape design, think about your sky as the negative space and your land as the positive space. And when you start breaking it down into just those two layers, you start to be able to make different decisions. So looking back up here at the examples I've already thrown in here, positive and negative space. I think the best of all of these so far is this one when it comes to those concepts. So negative space, the big sky in the center, somewhat in here with the baseland because we have an open area here, but then these big cliffs act as our positive space as well as the figure and on the cliff right here. So you have a fairly balanced composition here, a little bit of wiggle room whether or not to call that positive or negative space in the center, but, you know, space here, a little off balance because of the horizon being a lot higher, but it gives a much different idea when you start looking at the idea black versus white, positive versus negative space. Let's take this exact same concept. I want to pull this other sketch paper back down, and I want to simplify that down to just that, the positive and negative space. So if this was going to be a mini thumbnail in my sketchbook, it would probably look something like this. And that's it. Simple perspective to give myself an idea that this is open air, and then no details, no values, none of that. Just blocky shapes. And this is essentially just three big blobs. And that's where everything starts. Well, sometimes. And then when you define those lines out again, you can start adding some value to them and figuring out exactly where you want certain shapes and certain things to be. And what's interesting specifically about something like this is because this is just a blocky area of shapes, those didn't have to be cliffs. They can be whatever you want them to be. So the best part about starting with just big blobs and random shapes is you can change them. You can make them into something else. So I can take that exact same compositional idea and then, you know, make them big trees and pull them out that way. There's a lot that can be done while you're just working with the same general shape ideas. Round that out a little bit more, maybe make it a big root. And we'll put our figure on top of that. Add another one in, why not? That ends up being a little bit more in shadow. And we'll just add a few more sticks and things in to balance it out. So exact same general idea, split between those two, just with base level shapes, playing with positive and negative space. The shapes in this case give you an idea of just where your general subjects are. They don't necessarily define what the subject is, but they do define overall placement in the composition. So maybe I want a bigger monument or something up in here, so we'll use that as our larger space and shape. Maybe it sits up on a pedestal or something. Another big rock over here. Somewhere to put my figures or next to them. And then, you know, mountains or something in the background. Simple, basic ideas. Big blobs. Don't be afraid to really use your materials too, and not just use them a lot, but you know, turn them on their side. You know, switch it up a little bit. Pick a bigger material. If you're using pencils, a thick graphite stick where you literally cannot control detail, so you have to just be able to make big decisions about where you're putting things, and not necessarily worry about detail. Because if you're designing something from the ground up, just trying to figure out what lives in that space, detail is not something you need to worry about. Now, once you have a general idea of what you're making, it is important to then go back in and start playing, at least rudimentarily speaking, with value. You know, for example, a very basic example here, but in using the blocking out method, especially with darker values and things like that, and positive and negative space, you can have a big circle or something like that, and that's a good shape. It can be anything. But until you add value, a circle doesn't become a sphere, and a big triangle doesn't become a mountain or a pyramid or what have you. So when it comes to putting in light and stuff like that, if you guys see a lot of my sketches, you'll note that I'll use this symbol, which is a circle, 2 lines, and turning into an arrow. This I use to denote this is where my light source is coming from, especially if it's not just an obvious sun sitting somewhere on the picture plane. So once you have an idea of where your light source is coming from, exactly what's going to be happening, then you can obviously move and work with your shadows. Anyone who's ever done a still life is going to know that you got to really pay attention to where your still life or where your light source is to know exactly how to shadow a piece. One of my tricks is that even if perspectives go in one way, perspectives go in the other way, your light source acts as another vanishing point for your shadows. So, in this case, it's pretty simple. We can extrapolate that out. Shadow for a sphere out there based on where the sun is. And our basic circle shape obviously becomes more of a ball. Let's go back up here to our early line example. So this is a good example of how to add a light source into perspective. Actually, I'm gonna jump over to this one instead. I think it'll be easier to show. So this is just basic 1-point perspective. Drop in a box. So I think for a lot of people the idea would be, put the sun where the vanishing point is. But obviously you don't have to do that. So I want my light to come from off the picture plane, from over here. And as a result, then that block will be shaded to reflect that light coming this way. Now, a lot of people will make the thing like, well, I got to keep everything in perspective, so my shadow's going to be here. Your shadow's not going to be here. Your shadow's going to be opposite of your light source. This is a new vanishing point. Now, the lines of your shadow on this side will still need to be your vanishing point, but that ends up being another vanishing point to think about where your shadows are coming from. Now this may seem a little complicated, but this basic concept is exactly what I apply to every single landscape I do. So let's bring things back around here and tie some of this back to parts 1 and 2 of landscape design. There's a lot you can do with line, shape, value, color. We will get to hopefully in another part of this series in the future. But being able to map out a different, a composition based on sometimes even 1 or 2 point perspective, even what I call linear perspective, or it's called linear perspective. I tend to refer to it as 0 point perspective, where nothing's necessarily going to a single point. Like, you can do the single point, but a lot of times in a landscape, it's more of a general area of a vanishing point. So think about, you know, big bar like this, and well, essentially it's a much further vanishing point out than where you're seeing on the horizon. So I'll do that a lot. I'll just have a general idea of everything, just kind of goes back that way. You can also think about it as, you know, lines being closer together at the horizon, and then further apart the closer, the more they get to the viewer. But using that idea, we can, you know, mess with different shapes as it is. In my mind at this point, I don't necessarily need to do the blocked out positive and negative space one. I'm essentially doing it in my head as I'm working. But it is, in many ways, I actually needed an eraser for the first time today. Gonna mess with that horizon just a little bit. So this comes down, that comes up. There's an area here, a little further back. A little bit of a layered idea. So I like that. I'll take that a little bit bigger. Utilizing that. River running through the middle here. In this case, I'm using value more to establish land masses than I am value for that. We'll put our sun coming top down. Start thinking about that just a little. This upper section is going to be a whole different part of that. Maybe another path or something coming through here. Figures will be on that road. And utilizing value to tell a bit more information as to what lives in this world. We can even take another layer up in the back and give the indication of something back there. Could even take it a step further. One of the things I talked about in part one of this series was natural framing. Now, we've already done that a little bit, giving the idea of these cliffs pointing our eye down. This as well points our eye this way for, you know, maybe like what I was saying, something in the background like a castle or a city or something back in here to push our focal points in. We could take it a step further, put a nice big tree in here to point the viewer's attention towards the center. And just like that, we've got ourselves a simple little landscape concept. So, despite the bit of rambling I've done here today, I hope you guys can see that the idea of designing and building landscapes is not as complicated as you might think. As long as you follow a lot of the basic elements and principles of design, you can do pretty much anything you want. The core structure of perspective is there in every one of my paintings, and honestly, the simple ideas of shape, space, and value dictate almost everything that I do. With all of these things in mind, I will be excited to see what you guys create for your next project. If you would like to share them, please join the Discord community, available in the description box below, as well as all of my social links and all of that stuff. But for this video, this has been reminding you to keep on creating, and I will see you guys next time. I almost said drink responsibly. That's a different channel.